Somewhere in the frozen earth of the Eurasian steppe, sealed inside burial mounds the size of small hills, the Scythians left behind their dead. Gold animals frozen mid-leap. Sacrificed horses arranged in perfect rows. Weapons laid beside warriors who had terrorized every civilization from Greece to China. For 2 centuries, we thought we understood who these people were. The original horse lords, Iranian nomads from the eastern steppe who swept westward, built nothing permanent, left no cities, and eventually dissolved into the populations that replaced them. A people who came, conquered, and vanished. Then ancient DNA was extracted from those frozen tombs, and when the results came back, nearly everything the textbooks had assembled fell apart. The Scythians were not who we were told they were. Their origins were wrong. Their disappearance was wrong. And the truth of what actually happened to them has been hiding in the genetics of living Europeans the entire time. To understand what the DNA overturned, you first have to understand what it was overturning. And that means going back to the story that settled into textbooks across the 20th century and stayed there, largely unchallenged, for generations. The standard narrative of the Scythians begins on the eastern steppe, somewhere near the Altai Mountains, around the turn of the first millennium BC. A nomadic people, linguistically Iranian, culturally distinct, militarily extraordinary, who migrated westward across the Pontic Caspian steppe around 900 BC, displacing the Sumerians and establishing dominance over a territory that stretched from the Danube to the edges of the Chinese world. They left no cities. They built no monuments in stone. What they left instead were kurgans, massive burial mounds rising from the flat grasslands like frozen waves, packed with gold and weapons and sacrificed horses and the bodies of kings. And they were, by any measurable standard, extraordinary. The Scythians perfected the mounted archer centuries before anyone else made it the backbone of an army. Their composite bow, built from wood and horn and sinew, was a precision instrument powerful enough to punch through armor at full gallop. Warriors trained from childhood, their accuracy described by ancient observers in terms that sound like exaggeration until the archaeology confirms it. They wielded short swords and throwing javelins and heavy iron spears. They fought in coordinated mobile formations that no infantry force of the ancient world had a reliable answer for. The civilizations that encountered them remembered the experience. The Scythians devastated Assyria. They pushed into Egypt and extracted tribute from a pharaoh who decided gifts were preferable to battle. They helped bring down Nineveh. They fought Cyrus the Great to his death and sent Darius the First retreating back across the Danube, having accomplished nothing. The Greeks, who lived alongside them on the northern Black Sea coast for centuries, were simultaneously fascinated and terrified. And it was a Greek, Herodotus, who gave us the most detailed portrait of the Scythians that survived antiquity. He described their animal-style art, intricate gold pieces depicting stags and griffins and wildcats in motion. He described their clothing, their ritual use of cannabis burned in sealed tents, their habit of drinking from the skulls of defeated enemies. He described warrior women who fought alongside men and whose ferocity was so alien to the Greek imagination that they became the mythological Amazons. He described a tiered society with royal tribes at the top who looked upon the others, in his words, as slaves. This was the Scythian of the textbooks. A nomadic Iranian warrior culture born in the east, dominant across the steppe for roughly 6 centuries, then gradually displaced by the Sarmatians, fragmented by the Goths and the Huns, absorbed into the populations that came after. A people who left gold and bones and a reputation, and then disappeared. It was a clean story. A civilization rose. A civilization faded. Here are the kurgans they left behind. The problem is that nearly every part of that story was constructed before anyone could read the bones. Ancient DNA analysis of Scythian remains did not begin with a single dramatic study. It built slowly across a decade as researchers extracted genetic material from kurgan burials scattered across thousands of miles of steppe, from the Pontic grasslands west of the Black Sea to the Altai foothills of Central Asia. By the early 2020s, enough samples had been sequenced and compared that a coherent picture was beginning to emerge, and the picture did not match the textbook. The first thing the DNA established was that the Scythians were never a single genetically uniform people. Across the full geographic range of Scythian-associated burials, the genetic diversity was extraordinary. The eastern Saka tribes of Central Asia and the western Scythians of the Pontic steppe showed meaningfully different ancestral profiles. They shared a cultural complex, a military technology, an art style, a broad linguistic family. But biologically, they were not the same population moving as a coherent unit across the steppe. They were distinct peoples connected by cultural more than by blood. That finding alone complicated the migration narrative. But it was the Western Scythians, the ones Herodotus knew, the ones who fought Persia and traded with the Greeks, whose genetic profile proved most disruptive to the standard story. The textbook version assumed they had arrived from the east. Their language pointed east. Their cultural connections pointed east. The assumption was that a population had moved westward, bringing Scythian identity with it, like cargo. What the DNA showed instead was that the dominant ancestry component in the Western Scythian population was not Eastern at all. It was local. It traced back to populations that had been present in the Pontic steppe and the broader Eastern European region for centuries before Scythian culture crystallized. Specifically, it connected to the earlier Bronze Age Yamnaya horizon and the subsequent corded war populations, the same deep Western steppe ancestry that had been accumulating in the region for more than 1,000 years before the first Scythian kurgan was raised. In plain terms, the Western Scythians were, in significant biological part, the descendants of people who had never left. Scythian culture had not arrived wholesale from the east and replaced what was there. It had emerged at least partly from within a population with deep roots in the very territory the Scythians came to dominate. This created an immediate problem for the standard model, and it deepened when researchers examined the linguistic evidence alongside the genomic data. The Scythian language belonged to the Eastern Iranian family, yet the population speaking it carried predominantly Western steppe ancestry. Language and genetics were pointing in opposite directions. What that disconnect reveals is something archaeologists and geneticists have now documented repeatedly across the ancient world. Culture travels faster than people. A language, a military technology, a religious system, an art style can spread across existing populations through elite contact, through trade, through conquest, without requiring the wholesale replacement of those populations. The Scythian identity appears to have spread, in significant part, exactly that way. The Eastern steppe had contributed something to the Western Scythians, but it had not built them from scratch. The kurgans were never democratic. Anyone standing at the base of a royal Scythian burial mound and looking up understood that immediately. Some of these structures rose more than 20 meters from the flat steppe floor, requiring coordinated labor on a scale that does not happen without someone compelling it. The gold inside them, the weapons, the dozens of sacrificed horses arranged in precise geometric patterns, the human retainers killed and interred alongside their king, none of this was the archaeology of an egalitarian society. It was the archaeology of concentrated, hereditary, absolute power. What ancient DNA added to that picture was the biological dimension. And what it revealed inside the elite kurgans was a pattern that should have ended the simple nomadic warrior narrative on its own. The ruling individuals buried in the highest status kurgans of the Pontic steppe showed a genetic profile measurably different from the broader Scythian population surrounding them. Where the general population carried the predominantly local Western steppe ancestry described in the previous findings, the elite burials showed elevated proportions of Eastern steppe signals, and in some cases, additional ancestry components pointing toward Siberian and Central Asian populations. The ruling class, in other words, carried more of the Eastern genetic signature than the people they ruled. The structure this implies is not a unified people moving and settling together. It is a two-tier society. a ruling lineage with stronger connections to the eastern steppe, sitting atop a broader population with older, deeper roots in the western steppe and eastern Europe. Power concentrated in the hands of those who carried the more recent, more eastern ancestry, everyone else constituting the foundation on which that power rested. The parallel to what DNA revealed at Chaco Canyon is precise and uncomfortable. A small incoming elite, genetically distinct from the local population, establishing itself at the apex of a social structure and holding that position across generations. The mechanism of control different, the pattern identical. The grave goods made the hierarchy visible. The genetics confirmed it was biological as well as ceremonial. Then came the warrior women. Herodotus had written about Scythian females who fought alongside men, and the ancient Greeks had turned that observation into the myth of the Amazons. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists had been quietly reassigning weapon-bearing kurgan burials to male occupants when the Greek accounts seemed too fantastical to take seriously. Ancient DNA ended that practice definitively. Multiple burials across the Pontian steppe containing swords, arrows, and armor were sequenced and confirmed as biologically female. The Amazons were not a myth. They were a misidentification, corrected by genetics. What the female warrior burials revealed beyond the obvious was something about how Scythian identity and power were transmitted. Warrior status was not exclusively male. It was available across gender lines in ways that no sedentary civilization of the same period had institutionalized. And the DNA showed that these women were not outliers from foreign populations. They were members of the same communities, the same lineages, as the men buried beside them. Power in the Scythian world was concentrated at the top. But at the top, it was distributed in ways the textbooks had consistently failed to see. Herodotus wrote things about the Scythians that later readers found easy to dismiss, that they scalped their enemies and used the skins as napkins, that they drank the blood of the first man they killed in battle, that at the funeral of a king, a wife, servants, horses, and assorted retainers were strangled and buried alongside the royal corpse, arranged in careful formation above the tomb as if frozen in the act of eternal attendance. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, these accounts were treated as the exaggerations of a Greek observer projecting barbarism onto people his civilization found useful to fear. Colorful details, probably embellished, not to be taken too literally. The archaeology has spent the last several decades proving Herodotus right. Excavations of royal kurgans across the Pontian steppe have confirmed the sacrificial retainer burials in precise and repeated detail. Not one or two anomalous cases, but a consistent pattern across elite burial sites spanning centuries. Horses by the dozens, their skeletons arranged in radiating formations around the burial chamber. Human remains of servants and warriors interred in postures that suggest they were killed specifically for the occasion, positioned as if still in service. The skeletal trauma patterns on sacrificed retainers show ligature marks and perimortem injuries consistent with ritual killing rather than battlefield death. These were not people who died naturally and were honored with burial near their king. They were killed to accompany him. The cannabis evidence followed the same pattern. Herodotus had described Scythian purification rituals in which hemp seeds were thrown onto heated stones inside sealed tent structures, producing vapors that made the participants cry out with pleasure. This account was treated for generations as either metaphor or exaggeration. Archaeobotanical analysis of kurgan contexts subsequently identified cannabis residue in ceramic braziers and purpose-built tent frames at multiple burial sites across the steppe. The ritual Herodotus described was real. The archaeology confirmed it with biochemical precision. Then the DNA added a dimension that the material evidence alone could not provide. When researchers sequenced the sacrificed individuals found in elite kurgans, the results showed something significant. The genetic profiles of the retainers buried alongside Scythian royalty frequently differed from the genetic profiles of the ruling individuals they accompanied. The ancestry signals in sacrificed individuals skewed toward populations outside the core Scythian ruling lineage, suggesting they were drawn not from the same community as their masters, but from subjugated or peripheral populations incorporated into the Scythian system through conquest or tribute. The implications are direct. The spectacular violence of Scythian royal funerals was not a community grieving together. It was a demonstration of absolute power over other human lives, performed at the moment of maximum ceremonial weight, witnessed by everyone within reach of the kurgan's shadow. The peaceful nomad is a stereotype as durable and as false as the peaceful farmer. The Scythian world was hierarchical, religiously organized, and maintained in part through the conspicuous, public, theologically sanctioned destruction of human life. Not as an aberration, as a system. The bones confirm it. The DNA confirms who bore the cost. The standard account of what happened to the Scythians is a story of erasure. The Sarmatians pushed them west. The Goths fragmented them. The Huns finished the process. And whatever remained dissolved into the medieval populations that swept across the Pontic steppe in the centuries that followed. A people who had once made Persia retreat and extracted tribute from Egypt were absorbed, assimilated, and effectively ceased to exist as any kind of coherent presence. The textbooks closed the chapter somewhere around the early centuries AD and moved on. Ancient DNA did not accept that conclusion. When researchers tracked the genetic signature associated with the Western Scythian population forward through time, across Iron Age samples, through Roman period burials, into medieval cemetery assemblages across Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, the signal did not vanish. It attenuated, it mixed, it moved, but it persisted. The ancestry component identifiable in Scythian-era burials continued to appear in the populations that came after, not as a dominant signal in every sample, but as a consistent, traceable presence woven into the genetic fabric of regions the Scythians had once controlled. The most direct line of continuity ran through the Alans. The medieval Alan Confederacy, which established a powerful presence in the Caucasus between roughly the 4th and 13th centuries AD, showed genetic profiles with clear and substantial continuity from the Scythian-era steppe populations. They were not a separate people who happened to occupy the same territory. They were, in meaningful biological terms, a continuation of the same population under a different name, carrying forward the steppe ancestry that traced back through the Scythian period and beyond. The Mongol invasion of 1239 destroyed the Alan kingdom, but it did not destroy the Alans. Their descendants remained in the Caucasus, and they are present there today. The modern Ossetians, a people living in the mountains between Russia and Georgia, carry one of the strongest and most direct genetic echoes of the ancient Scythian world surviving anywhere on Earth. And they speak Ossetic, the only living language that descends directly from the Scythian language family. The horse lords of the ancient world have a voice in the modern world. It has been speaking continuously for more than 2,000 years. Beyond the Ossetians, the broader diffusion of Scythian-associated ancestry into Eastern European and Caucasian populations means that the genetic legacy of the steppe empire is not confined to a single surviving community. It is distributed across a wide arc of modern populations, present in proportions that vary but do not disappear. The Scythians were not erased. They were incorporated, partially and unevenly, into the peoples that came after them, exactly as those peoples were incorporated into the ones that followed. The chapter the textbooks closed was never actually closed. It was continued under different headings, in different languages, across populations that carried the biological record of the steppe empire forward without anyone in the academic world paying sufficient attention. The disappearance of the Scythians was a narrative convenience. The genetics made that clear. They did not vanish. They became. The Scythian DNA findings do not exist in isolation. They are part of a pattern that ancient genomics has now documented repeatedly across the ancient world, and the pattern has a consistent shape. The story written before genetics was almost always too simple, too clean, too comfortable. And the story written after is almost always more layered, more violent, and more human. What the Scythian case demonstrates with particular clarity is the separation between genetic ancestry and cultural identity. The Western Scythians carried predominantly local Western steppe ancestry but spoke an Eastern Iranian language and practiced a cultural complex with deep Eastern connections. Language and biology pointed in different directions. That disconnect is not an anomaly, it is a mechanism. It shows how a cultural system, a language, a military technology, a religious framework, an artistic tradition can spread across existing populations through elite contact and conquest without requiring the wholesale biological replacement of those populations. Culture moves faster than people. It always has. This has direct implications for one of the largest unresolved questions in prehistoric Europe. The spread of Indo-European languages across the continent is a problem that has generated more competing theories than perhaps any other question in ancient history. The Scythian case provides a working model for how that spread may have operated in other contexts, not always through mass migration replacing existing populations entirely, sometimes through exactly the mechanism visible in the Scythian data. A militarily and organizationally dominant group transmitting language and identity downward through a social hierarchy into a population that was already there, already numerous, and already the biological majority. The problem of Herodotus runs through all of this. He gave us the most detailed ancient portrait of the Scythians available, and he was a careful and genuinely curious observer by the standards of his time. But he was also an outsider, filtering everything he saw through Greek assumptions about what barbarian peoples were and what they meant. The DNA gives us something Herodotus could not. It gives us the Scythians' own biological record, unmediated by anyone else's interpretive framework. And that record tells a story more complex than any outside observer constructed. What the Ossetians and other Caucasian communities have preserved in oral tradition and cultural memory runs parallel to what the Puebloan descendants preserved about Chaco. Communities that carried the actual continuity of a civilization were told by the academic world that the civilization they descended from had vanished. The genetics confirmed what those communities had maintained all along. The disappearance was a projection, not a fact. The pattern that keeps repeating is not accidental. It reflects something specific about how the academic world constructed ancient history before genomics existed. Without the ability to read biological evidence directly, researchers filled the gaps with the narratives that made the most structural sense, the cleanest rises and falls, the most satisfying endings. Genetics does not provide satisfying endings. It provides continuity, complexity, and the persistent, inconvenient presence of people who were never supposed to still be there. The Scythian story was never finished. It was simply misread as finished. Those are not the same thing. The burial mounds are still out there. Thousands of them, unexcavated, scattered across the steppe from the Danube to the Altai, frozen earth still holding gold and bone and genetic information that has not yet been read. What has been read has already dismantled the story that stood for 2 centuries. The Scythians were not a simple people. They were not a vanished people. They were a layered civilization, genetically diverse, hierarchically brutal, culturally explosive, whose influence reached from Greece to China and whose descendants never actually disappeared. Ancient DNA did not solve the mystery of the Scythians. It revealed that the mystery was a misreading, a people called lost while their genetic echo persisted in the mountains of the Caucasus, in the populations of Eastern Europe, in the only living language descended from a steppe empire that once made Persia flinch. The horse lords never stopped riding. We simply stopped looking.